I'm going to start by introducing Barbara Silva, and I'll introduce Phil when he's ready to come up, I think. So Barbara is the Communications Director with Support Our Students Alberta, a province-wide education advocacy group focusing on public education and focusing on students, really, and what is good for students. She's based out of Calgary, but makes it up to Edmonton and I think to other parts of the province quite often. And she's a friend of my organization, a friend of the Parkland Institute, and she's going to talk today about Alberta education, the predictable path to privatization. I wanted to mention too, Support Our Students Alberta is also the recipient of the Alberta Teachers Association's Advocacy for Public Education Award a couple of years ago. So they've been recognized very widely for the effective work that they do. So without further ado, Barbara, please.
Thank you. Gonna move that out of the way, right?
Don't need that, right?
I don't.
Okay, let's do this.
Awesome. I have to turn that on. Oh, it is. Okay, good morning. Thank you, Parkland Institute, for having us here today on Treaty 6 land. My name is Barbara Silva, and I'm with Support Our Students Alberta, public education advocacy group focused on promoting equitable and accessible public education. So our main focus for this discussion is going to be on how the Overton window of education has shifted to the right. We're concerned with growing privatization within the public system and the role progressives have had in this movement globally. We're going to discuss how we have slowly moved away from a truly public education system. Whether it's about our resources, our economy, our heritage fund, or education, Albertans love to boast about our uniqueness. But our education system is not unique. Like Australia, Chile, US, the UK, it's going to come up any minute now. Alberta's education system is built on a competition model. Our per-student funding model that follows students to their school of choice is essentially a voucher system. It's common around the world, and Alberta is no exception. We really need to be honest about that. Alberta does have a voucher system, and while its traits are unique, the system that it's built upon is not. A very quick overview of Alberta education. In Alberta, we fund private schools. They receive 70% of the per-student funding. $275 million a year follow students to private schools. That's a component of the voucher system. And 4% of our student population attends private schools. For this discussion, we are actually not concerned with private schools, because forces that see education as a commodity and want to create a market, they're not happy with 4%. They want to access 96% of the market. In fact, just on Monday, the Edmonton Journal printed an article by Michael Van Pelt of Cardis Institute, where he outright said Alberta should be growing its privatization marketed schools from 4% to 10%. To do this, privatizers must normalize privatization to the public market. And we're going to show how they do this using a very predictable strategy of exclusivity. Another component of Alberta education is charter schools. What's unique about charter schools in Alberta is that we're the only province in Canada to offer them, and they're limited to 15 schools. But what is not unique? They were introduced in 1994, same year as the US, with the same initial focus of having innovation and pedagogical research. While they're limited to 15 schools, exactly like in the United States, one school can have multiple campuses, which is how they get around that legislation. They're largely an urban phenomenon, and they have the legislated ability to deny students access. And again, I want to be really honest about what exists in Alberta. 3 weeks ago at the NDP convention, a resolution was passed to oppose a voucher system in education. But we already have one. It already exists. That funding follows students to their school of choice, that $275 million a year leaves the public system to subsidize the private is a voucher system, and it's not unique. It has some unique traits. In Canada, the voucher goes straight to the school board or the school. In the US, it goes to the parent and then to the school of choice. Those are unique traits, but the system itself as a whole is not unique. So we can take a look at a couple of examples of some charter schools. This is the Calgary Arts Academy. It's a progressive public charter school teaching the arts curriculum through arts immersion. This school has a 5-step application process. These are screen caps from their website. The final stage is school acceptance. The school chooses who to let in. This makes this school exclusive. This school is infamously known for turning away a child with cerebral palsy in 2013. This school is classified as a public school. This school chooses its students and receives 100% of the student funding voucher. So other than tuition, this entire process replicates the privatization model. Two more examples. We've got Foundations for the Future Charter Academy. This school is classified as one school under the legislation. It has 7 campuses across Calgary. It has a 7-year wait list. You are recommended to put your child on that wait list as soon as you have a birth certificate. The application and wait list package is 13 pages long. Then we have Westmount Charter School. It's for gifted children. Again, 5-stage application process ending with your acceptance. Maybe. It requires a private psych ed assessment that can cost up to $2,000 per child. Again, these are classified as public schools. If the school accepts you, the charter receives the voucher. And this is how charter schools became the Trojan horse for privatization in education. So while most of us have been focused on this debate, private versus public, the focus of privatizers and education reformers, as they call themselves, has been to normalize exclusivity as a way to privatize public schools. So exclusivity, the ability to select your students, is how the privatization movement starts to access that 96%. And this is where we moved away from tuition as a marker of privatization, and we replaced it with barriers of exclusivity. So we're here today to talk about this side of the frame and not the left side. So we're all familiar with this meme and this strategy. We are all really, really able to recognize this when the lines are really clearly private versus public. But we have failed to recognize that public education is not immune to this strategy. This same strategy is under play right now under the public umbrella, and it's happening all over the world. Reformers are normalizing privatization by introducing exclusivity into the public system. So how do you create a market? Well, you create a market the same way you would any other product. Reformers consider education a commodity, like any other. So the same principles are going to apply to choosing a school as does choosing a phone. How do you create a market for an iPhone 10 when everyone has an iPhone 6? Well, you undermine, and then you personalize. If you've got an iPhone 6, you'll find your battery life becomes limited. You slow down operating systems. You make apps incompatible. You basically undermine the functionality of a 6 and then sell a 10 with personalization, right? You start to give you facial recognition, retina scan, faster operating systems, more apps, and it becomes something that you need. Education reformers will say this is the exact same pitch in education. You undermine curriculum, teachers, and underfund. And this is happening in Ontario. Kenny is bringing it to Alberta. Everywhere people want to privatize, you undermine teachers, you undermine curriculum, and you underfund the system. And the second step is to personalize this. So we start to normalize individual language around what used to be a collective good. We start to talk about me, my child, my school, my rights, my needs, as though my child's needs could never be met the way someone else's child's needs could be met. That's exclusivity. And the language in this strategy is incredibly predictable. It's happening everywhere selective schools exist. And it's really difficult to deconstruct. So some of the language in this pitch includes government schools versus independent schools. Education reformers love that language. It means public versus private. They have co-opted the words choice and equity. I mean, those are fundamental progressive words, and they morph them to talk about equity of choice. That means your personal right to choose. They talk very prolifically around parental rights, religious rights, taxpayer rights. You never hear about the children's rights. It's about taxpayers, parents, religious. They love to uphold standardized testings that we all know have inherent biases by talking about data-driven policy and research-based policy. And they love to undermine curriculum by talking in terms of back to basics and traditional learning, upholding sort of the old colonial ways that we used to teach children. We're not allowed to advance from that. And then, of course, the scare tactic that the government school is a one-size-fits-all model. And I have yet to meet a public education advocate who believes in a one-size-fits-all model. It's rhetoric, it's a scare tactic, and it doesn't actually apply. So what's the effect? Well, here is the competition model, the competition response to the introduction personalized learning has created. These are some of the schools that exist in the public system. These are schools that replicate the privatization process. These are schools that students apply to, schools that accept students, schools that are exclusive. This is our voucher system, and it includes hockey academies, French immersion, Hebrew bilingual, arts academies, Mandarin bilingual, science alternative, all-boys school, a Quranic worldview school, an all-girls school, traditional learning centers, gifted and talented education schools. These schools provide a sense of exclusivity because they present very real barriers to many children, primarily our most marginalized children. And this is where our advocacy is focused. This is what privatization looks like under the public umbrella. So we've now reshaped public education as exclusive. Here in Edmonton, Edmonton Public now puts out guiding documents on how to navigate high schools. Language that includes researcher options. How do you apply to schools? We have a school in Edmonton, Old Scona, has a 4-part, 2.5-hour entrance exam to get into a high school. Call that what it is, it's academic streaming. And we have started emulating the university application process. Look into your high schools, prepare for exams, apply, go to open houses. It's a university application process that we've now brought down to 14-year-olds. Again, there is very little difference between this process and the process required to get into a private school. Two more examples of public schools that are exclusive. We have the Traditional Learning Center. They use this crazy language where now these schools are referred to as rigorous and academic. It's a school. Now we're calling schools academic. Or we have the Gifted and Talented Education program where they expect kids to be very curious about many topics, use advanced vocabulary or a keen sense of humor. This is now how we're defining public education. I want to add 2 points to this. A reminder, these are urban phenomenons. So if your child is gifted and in high level, you're hooped. And at the same time, we're saying that this is necessary. So if gifted education is really and truly necessary, why are rural children entirely excluded? Are children of color, children in poverty, children with physical disabilities less likely to be diagnosed as gifted? Especially when giftedness presents with many behavioral issues. So what is the likelihood that a child of color acting out is tested for giftedness versus an affluent child acting out of boredom? Everywhere else that this is studied, and we don't study it in Alberta because we do not collect race-based statistics, but everywhere else, such as this Walrus article, people are asking, who gets to be gifted? Kids in the gifted programs are disproportionately white and affluent. House streaming has become another form of segregation. Other people are talking about this. We're not the only ones having this discussion. In fact, very worthwhile. It's a 2.5-minute video. I suggest you watch it. Viewpoint by Rachel Giza of the CBC identifies both Ontario and Alberta as having programs so exclusive, she calls it the resegregation of Canadian public schools. Like Rachel, we at SOS agree that the programming of these schools, it's amazing and it's impressive, but it's inaccessible and it's selective. Currently, the education model serves to benefit the most advantaged in our society, those who can apply, those who can afford private testing, those who can buy homes in affluent neighborhoods, or who can pay for transportation. It's built around parents who can lobby for exclusive programming and who can fundraise for resources. This is our current system. This inequity is happening everywhere school choice is promoted, and Alberta is not unique. So now we've defined public schools as rigorous and academic. And we're going to use French immersion as the prevailing example here simply because it exists across the country. The same principle applies to any of these other selective schools, whether they're traditional learning, arts programming, science programming, or any other of the other boutique programs that exist in Ontario and Alberta. But French immersion has been the subject of intense scrutiny across Canada because of its ability to cream skim students. And we've collected some screen caps of articles that document the effect selective schools like French immersion have on the system. And some of the criticisms include, out of Toronto, if you can't cut it being French immersion programs, you probably fall into one of these three categories. You're a newcomer, it's your third language, you've got some learning challenges, or there's a socioeconomic factor. It's also now been described that French immersion has become the private school within the public system, that it has become an elitist, very restrictive system geared to benefit a certain type of student. And that's, the heading right there is out of McLean's. It was meant to inspire national unity. It's turned into an elitist, divisive, and deeply troubled system. Out of Vancouver, the screen cap says, French immersion programming allows white middle-class parents to access higher markers of social status and prestige. In New Brunswick, it's been noted that special needs segregation is pronounced in French immersion versus English stream. And this is the important part. This kind of segregation is not unique to that province. It's not unique. We've already shown it in Toronto, in Vancouver, in New Brunswick. It happens in Alberta. We posted these screen caps to highlight that this phenomenon is not something SOS has invented. We're not manufacturing it. French immersion has been under scrutiny for this type of exclusivity for years, and exclusivity is what selective schools are selling. Selective schools are having this effect everywhere they exist. And we cannot reiterate this enough, how extensively these discussions are happening around the globe. In Spain, in Australia, in the UK and the US, the proliferation of selective schools under the public umbrella is now known as educational apartheid. No one in Alberta is engaging in this discussion. We are too busy trying to gently find common ground, to finding reasonable limits to choice, and quite frankly, we are preoccupied with the private versus public debate. And I can hear it now because we've heard it all before, the gasps and the horror, but French immersion, we have two languages, it's our official language, and I need my child to learn, and we have heard it all. And there are endless ways to defend the intent behind these programs. The intent behind a science program, the intent behind a Mandarin bilingual, the intent behind a gifted program. We are not here to debate the intent of the programs. We are here to highlight the impact of these programs. And the impact has been neither positive nor constructive for public education. The impact has been to start othering. And these are some of the ways as a public education advocacy organization that people speak to us, parents, students, teachers, administrators will tell us. The first one is a neighbor of mine who's having troubles at her community school and says, if I would have known, I would have put my child in French immersion because those kids wouldn't cut it there. The most egregious statement, the one that breaks our heart the most, is this school is not for everyone. And it's said as a point of pride now. We now have students, parents, teachers, and administrators saying, the school just isn't for everyone, as a point of pride. And this is where we are in public education, that this school is not for everyone has become a point of pride. What happened? How did we let public education, once built on the very premise that it was for everyone, become this exclusive? Well, We bought into the personal nature of the cell. All of us, progressives and conservatives alike. There has been no resistance to this movement. There has been no objection to a public system that now has high schools that require entrance exams. We have public schools that require interviews and auditions, that require private assessments, that segregate children based on religion or culture. There has been no objection to the fact that public schools now have the ability to choose their students. Not school boards, not trustees, not MLAs, not even the ATA, not even the minister has voiced any concern that all of this inequity is happening under the public umbrella. Choice is now so prolific, the lines are so blurred, both progressives and conservatives alike defend it. Conservatives have literally altered the definition of public education, and they've shifted that Overton window. They've encountered no opposition in doing so. In fact, we have helped push it there. The lines are so blurred, in fact, that when leaders from either end of the political spectrum speak about education in Alberta, they are virtually indistinguishable. I'll give you a moment to read those. Indistinguishable. It should be noted how rarely, how infrequently education in Alberta is referred to anymore as public education. They won't even say the words public anymore. Left and right defending choice, neither mentions public education, much less defends it. This is how blurred the lines are. So we're here today to say, stop worrying about privatization in education. Don't worry, it's here. Don't worry about it coming. It's actually here. Our system is already privatized. Other than tuition, we now have public schools that counsel children out of attending, that have application procedures, that require private testing, that have wait lists. It's already a system built around wealthy, educated, engaged families. And the system is not broken. It's working exactly as it was designed by Ralph Klein in 1994 to work. To separate communities, to segregate children, and to maintain power structures. The system isn't broken, folks. It's working exactly as it was designed to. So where are our champions? Everyone was focused on the private versus public debate. We fell for this trap that choice would solve the inequity. So we started to offer choice to solve this inequity, help them see over the fence. We gave them boxes that cost money, boxes that required private testing, boxes that required English language proficiency, boxes that required auditions. And this is how we let the Trojan horse in. The conversation we should be having is not public versus private. It's how we let statements like, this school is not for everyone, become acceptable. It's how we let schools choose students. It's how we accepted boxes as a fix when we should have been trying to remove the fence. Where is the vision for this system? As progressives, we can not only advocate for the redistribution of wealth, but actively redistribute privilege and opportunity. It's time to redefine public education. It's time to return to universality. We need a public system that accepts all students, that has gifted students, disabled students, LGBTQ students, Christian students, Muslim students, newcomer students, poor students, all learning side by side. It's time to stand in solidarity with advocates around the world, and more importantly, as progressives, to stand in solidarity with marginalized children across this province who are consistently excluded from public education under the guise of choice. The debate we need to move forward is about where is the universality in public education. So we're going to leave you with a few thoughts from Nicole Hannah-Jones, an investigative journalist and public school advocate based in New York City. She challenges us and says, as special as my kid is, I don't think she deserves more than other kids. And you can't have it both ways. You can't say you believe in equality and hoard opportunity for your own child. And this is where we are. We must want for all children what we have been accessing for our own and return public education to the public. We must stop chasing choice and return to universality. And true universality means that the only thing a public school should ever say to a child who wants to attend it is welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. That was extremely inspirational and challenging to, I know me for sure, and I think to everybody in this room. Thank you, Barbara, for that incredible presentation. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Philip McRae, who's known around the Alberta Teachers Association as Dr. Phil, and I know he'll answer to that from anybody. Phil is the Associate Coordinator Research with the Alberta Teachers Association and an adjunct professor with the Faculty of Education at the U of A. He also sits with me on the advisory board to the Parkland Institute, so he's a good friend of the organization as well. And he's got a presentation that, well, I'll let you describe it, but to me feels like it's about neoliberalism in education is the description you gave to me in quite a few words. That's what I would boil it down to, and I'll let you take it away, Phil.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank Barb. I think the advocacy for public education has to come from all corners now. I'm a ranch kid from Pincher Creek, and the reason I think had social mobility and got a PhD and now work on behalf of all the teachers is because I went to school where you talk about universality, right? My mom was an English teacher in Pincher Creek and taught the Supreme Court Justice and others. Like this is, the idea that we can have great schools for all really is predicated on equity, right? So you can't have an excellent education system when you have growing inequities, when the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, the Matthew effect. All of these things, the segregation. We know that around the world, if you look at research, that's a really fundamental thing. You cannot have an excellent education system if you have growing inequities. So I really appreciate that advocacy, and we didn't plan this actually, but what's great about it is I'm actually going to go deeper into personalization and talk about what's driving that, and choice. I'm going to talk a little bit about standardization and how privatization is predicated on standardization, because there are these four forces around the world that are actually affecting the movement around privatization of public education systems, and what I hope to do is really help kind of articulate that with you. But before I do that, and at the very end I'll give you a link to the material and so on here. But I really believe in Margaret Wheatley's statement that there's no power greater than a community discovering what it cares about. And to see a room like this that's full of people who care about public education is really powerful for me. Margaret Wheatley, who also advised Obama around his community work at times, said, what's the answer to the problem of privatization in public education? The answer is community, right, fundamentally. And here's a community, I think, that really cares. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover three pieces. What? And the what is really, what is the purpose of public education? I want to step back for a moment, and I want you to think about what the purpose of a public education system is. Why do we have it? How did it, I'm a sixth-generation ranch kid from Pincher Creek. My grandfather and my great-grandfather were building in the rural communities public school systems. So it's important for us to step back for a minute and think about why do we even have that in our province, in our country. Then I'm going to talk about these four forces. That's the so what, right? So what's driving this privatization movement around the world and really influencing us in Alberta? Personalization, standardization, privatization, and a new term, which is datafication, right? Data is the new oil. Being able to get data and use that data for profit, that's really the fundamental growth industry in the movement around privatization and public education. And then I want to leave you with, at 11:30 now, what are we going to do about this together? Because again, the answer to any problem is community, right? The answer is how do we, in multiple different avenues and spaces, really affect change. So I'm going to ask you just to turn to somebody sitting beside you or in front of you or behind you. You can introduce yourself if you don't know each other. And just for a couple of minutes, please share with them what you think the purpose of a public education system is. Why do we have it? Okay, just a couple of minutes, introduce yourselves, and what do you think the purpose is? If I can get your attention, my apologies. I know that once you start the conversation, it's hard to stop it. However, I'm really interested in what you think the purpose of a public education is. So would anybody in the room like to share what they think? Barb, yeah. Yeah, right at the back. Yeah, you had your hand up? No, sorry, yeah, go ahead. Enabling different points of view. So the idea of diversity of thinking. Right. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, what's important about that, too, is diversity, right, of ideas, of people, is really the source of any system's intelligence. You can't have an intelligent system without diversity, right? Otherwise, you have a mob. So we often talk about diversity as something that you have to encourage. What else? Levels the playing field, yeah. Yeah, trying to bridge that gap of inequality. At the back. Right. So this idea of citizen versus drone worker, or I have to tell you, I mean, I do keynotes all over. I've just been in Helsinki, Reykjavik. I just did a keynote for 800 elementary teachers last Saturday. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot is, again, what is the purpose of a new curriculum? What is the purpose of an education system? Because we need to step back for a moment and think about that. And the idea of, are we building citizens or consumers is really at the heart of a big part of the debate right now. Last one, yeah. Right. Well, this is interesting. I mean, this is part of back to what Barb's point is around universality, is that everybody has access to an education system. I grew up on a ranch outside of Pincher Creek, and we didn't, have great wealth that would give us some kind of a private school. It was that the public education system gives everybody access to that ability to thrive and flourish within a society. In 1859, Herbert Spencer asked this question: what knowledge is of most worth? Which really is the foundation of our current education system and the curriculum. And there was a committee of 10 in the United States, and they decided that mathematics, geography, Latin, those were the things that were of most worth, that those are the things that you had to teach. And citizenship really was actually at the core of a lot of the discussion of public education systems. Now we hear the dialogue around coding, right? What knowledge is of most worth? Well, it's about coding, and it's why. I was with the vice president of I think the second largest company in the world, actually, in Ottawa at a meeting. And we were sitting having lunch, and he was telling me this is a war for talent. If you guys don't teach kids to code in the education system, we'll do it. And it was really a very interesting, I just about had a stroke, but an interesting conversation. But we're in that same time now. This is an interesting quote that really speaks to the current tension around the purpose of curriculum and public education. One school fixes its attention upon the importance of the subject matter of the curriculum as compared with the contents of the child's own experience. It's about math, it's about reading, literacy, numeracy, back to the basics. When Barb talked about the growth in charter schools, actually, that back to the basics movement is where there's a lot of push or growth. Not so, says the other school. The child is the starting point, the center, and the end. His development, his growth is the ideal. Not knowledge, but self-realization is the goal. When do you think this was written, and who wrote it? This is 1902 by John Dewey in The Child and the Curriculum. And, John Dewey talks about education is not preparation for life. It's not about creating the worker. Education is life itself. And I think that's really important to remember. Sometimes we drift to talk about learning versus education. And when we talk about public education, we have to think broadly about the whole child. And what does that mean, right, in terms of the education system? So now let me get into these 4 forces. And what I really want to do, this is like, I'm Dr. Phil, right? So this is an inoculation. And the inoculation is I really want to give you a sense of these 4 interrelated forces that are reshaping public education systems in Alberta, but all over the world. We were approached by Education International, which represents 45 million teachers. So as an executive staff officer with the ATA and associate coordinator of research, they asked us in Alberta to help frame these big issues that are impacting public education systems and kind of fueling privatization. So what we decided to do is we decided to create video. And it's at wetheeducators.com, 4 videos actually, on each of these. And I'm going to show them to you, but at the end of this, I really encourage you to help spread them around on, what's forcing privatization and personalization and standardization. Before I get into that, so what, I really think this is important. Right? No one is coming to save us from these 4 forces except ourselves. Right? This is an old hoppy saying that I think is fundamental right now. If we think that somebody will save the public education system outside the individual citizen or just organizations, Barb made the case it's not going to happen. Right? So this is important for us because at the individual and the collective level, we need to respond to these 4 forces. All right, so what are they? One of them is called personalization, and I'm going to deconstruct it with you and for you. But it's the idea that I'll get what I want, when I want, how I want it. The idea of choice, right? This push towards personalizing. However, you have to step back for a second. Who wants an education that isn't personalized? Right? I mean, this is not easy. Personalize and standardization actually are one of the conversations. Because we heard this, we need standardized curriculum. Well, you need to have standards without standardization, right? You need to have the ability to have a shared dialogue, but without everybody doing it lockstep at the same time. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in terms of privatization with a growing private school in the Education South called Bridges International. They have teacher computers that have scripted curriculum that at this moment in time you will say this, and at the next step you will say this, and the next step you will say this. That's standardization, right? It's a private school in a box. It's the fastest growing movement around privatization. The third force that I want to talk about is datafication, right? Simple, data is the new oil, right? The largest companies in the world right now are data companies. And the greatest movement into privatization right now is having the data on students and teachers to respond, to say, I will use this data in a standardized way to personalize your learning. You'll get exactly what you need when you need it. You won't even know you need it, and we'll give it to you, right? That is really the biggest movement right now, is to gather more and more data. It's why testing is on the rise, because that's how you get this new data. And then finally, all of this leads towards privatization, right? This private school in a box, or what we currently have in Alberta as a system, and the expansion of that system through these 4 forces, okay? So, here's the big question we started with when we met as a team around the world. I gathered a project team from all over the world to look at privatization, from Chile to Europe to the United States to Canada. And we asked this question, which is, how would you like to parents, how would you like your child's education? Personalized or standardized? And initially you think, well, everybody's going to say personalized, right? Actually, not necessarily. People say, I want to know that my child is going to get what they need. And the only way to do that is standardize it, right? To really force this standardization. And others say, no, actually, I want teachers to know my child. I want class sizes to be reasonable enough. They can build a relationship with them and get to know their interests and their passions and really help to expand those. So this isn't an easy conversation in terms of the two. Mm-hmm.
I have ways of personalizing, but we have to look at some material together so that we can have a conversation.
It's not necessarily a false dichotomy in the sense that when you ask people what they're looking for in their systems, in the education systems, a lot of them are driven towards privatization by this idea of standardization. What you probably did is you had standards for the curriculum and what we together will learn, not standardized, right? You didn't teach in your classroom exactly like somebody in Southern Alberta. You met those standards, that idea of shared curriculum, in different ways. Well, yeah, but the idea is that in a privatized system, they reduce that flexibility, they reduce that personalization, and they standardize it. So if you go to this school, or this school, or this school, you will get exactly the same thing, right? That's at least the push. So let me just show you a short 1-minute video on personalization that we produced that gives you a little bit of background to what this looks like.
How would you like your child's education, personalised or standardised? We, the educators, have made these short films to explore the differences, the choices we make, and what they mean for the future of public education. Personalisation is a relationship between people that demands a deep understanding of changing needs, unique talents, passions, and interests. Personalised learning, then, demands high-quality teaching that is responsive to the many different ways children can become their best selves. This means shaping teaching around the way different students learn, taking care to nurture the unique talents of every child. Teachers draw on a repertoire of strategies and techniques to tailor an education to meet the needs of every student, to create a great school that works for all. The teacher and the learner work together to keep the person in personalisation.
So where the privatization movement actually gets its energy around personalization is public schools can't personalize. You can't do it. You can't do it anymore. You have to use technology or a specialized system. It's just too complex, right? And if you break the system with 40 kids in a class and no supports, and that idea. But the idea is that when we talk about personalization, we need to own the term. We need to actually occupy this space. Personalization is about putting the person back in there, because every parent wants their children to be known and recognized in that school community, right? So it really is about the person, not just about the technology that will standardize it. This is Alberta Education's business plan from 2010 to 2013, and they put personalized learning in here. And it said, learning need not be restricted to brick and mortar classrooms during specific set hours. Authentic learning opportunities can be provided through a range of pathways that are appropriate to each student's developmental stage. Students need to be engaged in multiple ways to create new learning possibilities that are available. You ready? This is important. Anywhere, anytime, any place, and at any pace. In other words, through a range of learning environments that provide flexible timing and pacing to meet diverse learning needs. So really, you can learn anywhere, by anyone, at any time, any place, or any pace. I remember that the individual who actually wrote this into the business plan was one of my graduate students when I was a professor here at the University of Alberta. And he said to me over lunch, "Help us figure this out, Dr. Phil." And I said, "Well, don't put it in the business plan before you've figured it out." This is an idea struggling for an identity, personalization. It's not a pedagogic theory. It doesn't exist in terms of the learning sciences. It's this idea that's being marketed and pushed around. But this is where it comes from. This is Westmount, right, in Edmonton, near where we live. The McDonald's, any lane, any time, right? I still don't know what that means. I'm still confused. You know, what does this actually mean for us? Any place TV, you can get it on your tablet, on your phone, on your television, your game box, your system. You can get 500 channels. You can start watching it here. You can continue watching it there. And it is available at any place, at any pace, at any point in time. Right? This is what personalization is being reframed at, is really about choice, your ability to get things. This morning, if I went into Starbucks to get a cup of coffee, right? And I'm actually pretty much just a cup of coffee guy, but I asked them, I said, you know, in terms of personalizing this cup of coffee, they write your name on it, right? And they give you exactly the type of combination of coffee you want. How many combinations of coffee do you think there are at Starbucks? 86,000 combinations, right? A quad venti, half calf hot, this, right? It's like crazy. If you look at something like ice cream, what's the name? 31 flavors. Baskin-Robbins. They have over 1,000 different types of ice cream, right? Diabetic coma. I mean, it's crazy in terms of the amount of choice that confronts us. This is what New Brunswick used in terms of their mantra for reform. Be student-centered and personalized, accessible anywhere, anytime. You can see this language now of consumption starting to move into the education sector, right? What I learn, how I learn, where I learn, I want it personalized. And really this idea that individuality is becoming the new conformity. Here's the fundamental problem in education. We don't learn on our own. Learning is socially constructed. Learning is collective. The very nature of the learning sciences means that you're not just isolated in front of a computer to learn, right? Anywhere, anytime, any place. It is actually a social act. So we have to take this term personalization and own it, occupy that space. And this idea of choice and the tyranny of choice, 86,000 combinations anywhere, anytime, when I want it, how I want it, at point of need. This is what's driving a lot of the conversation. There's a great conversation that we've been having in the Alberta Teachers Association around choice, because we now see anxiety and depression higher in the high school to university population than we've seen during the time of the Great Depression. Anxiety and depression and mental health concerns are fundamental. We are asking the question, to what extent does choice provoke anxiety in us, in our students, in society writ large? I would encourage you to read this book by Dr. Renata Sletchel, a sociologist from Eastern Europe. It's called The Tyranny of Choice. And I'll give you the Coles Notes version about this because I think it's important. Choice, in her argument, provokes anxiety for 3 reasons. The first is choice is social. We always follow others. Somebody sent their children to this school. I should send my child to that school. But it's not just that. What shoes are you wearing today? What did you bring for lunch, right? All of choice is very social. You don't really make an independent choice. We try to make the perfect choices. Oh, I got the wrong cell phone plan, right? Oh, I picked the wrong lane. I mean, it doesn't matter, but the idea is that there's 15 types of gluten-free bread and you pick the wrong type of gluten-free bread. Choice provokes anxiety. Or something like eHarmony, right? I picked the wrong mate. I mean, it's get ridiculous in terms of choice. As we age, we know that there is no perfect choice, right, in life. This has nothing to do with my wife. We've been married 25 years. I didn't meet her on eHarmony, for the record. Every choice involves a loss. I picked this, but I didn't pick that. I went to this school, I didn't go to that school. Actually, what you see is a churning in the United States with private schools. Lots of people now, because of that privatization and choice, they're jumping and jumping and jumping. And by the way, the grass isn't always greener, right? It's presented that way. But choice, I would argue, and buy into Dr. Sletchel's claim, provokes anxiety. It's one of the big drivers around privatization. Now, standardization. This is the next really big force that I think is important to understand as we lead towards privatization.
How would you like your child's education, personalised or standardised? We, the educators, have made these short films to explore the differences, the choices we make, and what they mean for the future of public education. Standardization and standards are not the same thing. Simply put, standards are good, standardization isn't. Standards set a bar of expectations. They are critical for a healthy society, for example, in food safety or the quality of doctors and teachers. We want high standards for our children, but standardization is not the same as high standards. Having high standards doesn't mean that we all reach them in the same way. When a process is standardized, it can be repeated at a lower cost. Industrial manufacturing was built on these principles to reduce cost and standardize output. But standardization in education narrows learner choice, curriculum, opportunity, and value. Standardization empowers a process. Standards empower and protect the learner.
So the reason this is important is one of the arguments around standardization is that you will make everything the same, that if you go to this school, this is the big push. I look at this in terms of the tension between standardization and personalization in our system. So here's a teacher. Class, all year long, I've taught each of you to learn at your own pace, in your own personal style. I've set goals for each of you individually to help you reach your own unique potential, and now the results of that will be measured with a standardized test, right? There's this weird, like, I get a coffee cup with my name on it, but it's really standardized. I mean, this idea of personalization in these standardized processes or private schools in a box, it's not truly really deeply personalized, right? I think that's the challenge. This is the example of Bridge Academies, which was just actually kicked out of Uganda, but is growing all around the world. It was funded by the UK government, by Mark Zuckerberg, by Microsoft. There's a lot of big players that are funding and doing work with them. Bridge Academies' personalized standardization, right? Standardizing in a box looks like this. This is their teacher computers. So basically, every teacher is given a little tablet, and you have to, at exactly these points in time, follow the curriculum. You have to read it out. It's a scripted curriculum, right? So the next word is maze. Say maze. Call on people to come up to the board and write maze. If the pupil spells it correctly, give him or her a cheer. If the pupil spells it incorrectly, call on another pupil to come up and correct the spelling. Rub the board. The last word is pest. Say pest. I mean, it's crazy, right? That this is what's happening in terms of the standardization. But this is the idea of trying to create these markets around high quality with standardization. And data standards in education is the big profit area, right? So what we're seeing now across Commonwealth countries is that you need to take student information systems, library, food services, your student mark, your gradebook, transportation, HR, finance, put it all into one data system, and then use that data to make education more efficient. So what does that look like? Well, it's affecting all our lives. Here's what datafication, the third big force, looks like.
How would you like your child's education, personalised or standardised? We, the educators, have made these short films to explore the differences, the choices we make, and what they mean for the future of public education. Datafication is a technological trend turning many aspects of our lives into computerized data, using processes to transform organizations into data-driven enterprises by converting this information into new forms of value. Social media, for example, datafies our friendships to market products and services to us, and surveillance services to agencies, which in turn changes our behavior. Standardization narrows the school curriculum and learner choice to match specific testing regimes. Datafication then narrows teachers' autonomy to ensure the creation of good data based on these regimes. But children and teachers aren't data, so this won't be in their best interests.
Want to collect data on how children are learning? Know them, watch them, listen to them, talk with them, sit with them, be with them. That's from an Alberta teacher who is from Red Deer, who's passed away, unfortunately, at far too young an age, Joe Bauer. And it really speaks to this idea about data and datafication and the issues or the implications of it. Datafication is the ability to get data on you individually, to personalize your data, to take it, market it, and then know what you want before you know what it is. This is the big force actually fueling the largest growth in privatization in and out of public education systems around the world. I talked about this, data being the new oil, right? The value and the wealth that it is. But just to give you a sense of what it looks like in the North American market, ed tech and the data is $17 billion market, the largest segment of which is testing, digital testing of students, right? So this is big, big business and big money, and there's huge forces to this. So if I disappear one day, you know why. I'm just going to jump through the predictive analytics and some of the stuff that I talked about earlier there, but I think this is an important question. What counts in an education system, and who's counting? right? The ability to count is really about accountability, the quantification of everything that goes on in the system. What we need is responsibility, which is the ability to respond, not just accountabilities. Last and finally, privatization. So Barb did a great job kind of talking about this. We'll take a look at what the forces are like around the world.
How would you like your child's education, personalised or standardised? We, the educators, have made these short films to explore the differences, the choices we make, and what they mean for the future of public education. Privatisation transfers an industry or service from public to private interest. Proponents of privatisation believe competition in the private sector fosters more efficient practices, leading to better service and products, lower costs and less corruption. However, critics of privatisation argue that services such as healthcare, law enforcement or education should be in the public sector to ensure greater control and equitable access by society. It's hard to imagine an excellent education system or public sector without equity, and yet decisions about the public sector, including ownership, are too often made by those who do not use it. To be profitable, privatisation depends on standardization to scale, reducing cost-prohibitive services and the ability to meet unique needs.
And we didn't even plan this, Barb and I, but this quote we put in when we built these videos a couple of years ago, Noam Chomsky saying, you know, how do you create a private system? Really, fundamentally, you want to make sure that you break that system and then create a kind of a demand. Defund it, make sure things don't work, people get angry, and you hand it over to private capital. This is what's going to be interesting. We have a 4% private school population in Alberta, but it's not just the $10,000 to $40,000 tuition per year that privatization proponents are going after. They want everybody in the system, right? They want $1 from everybody, not $40,000 just from a few. This is where the big challenge is around the world, is the idea of expansion and what they call growing at the bottom of the pyramid. This is a great September 26 Dean publication called Schooling the Poor Profitably, Innovations and Deprivations of Bridges. I would really encourage you to read it. You can find it online. But here's a quote. When it comes to K through 12 education, we see a $500 billion sector in the US alone, that it's waiting desperately to be transformed by big breakthroughs that extend the reach of great teaching and is the forefront of individualized or personalized technology-based learning. This is from Rupert Murdoch and Fox News, who actually bought several education companies in the US. Again, the market is billions and billions of dollars. So just to wrap it up, now what? I'm thinking about a book that I read almost every summer. And John Ralston Soul was here. Ricardo, when was he here? 2 years ago. And I really love this book, The Unconscious Civilization, because I think what Barb and I are trying to do is bring consciousness to what is going on in terms of privatization. And I'm worried that we live in an unconscious civilization. I'm worried that what's happening is that we've drifted as a society in urban and rural Alberta, because public education wasn't non-negotiable, it was non-negotiable, just like public health. So why have we drifted? Why have we become more unconscious? And his argument is that it's corporatism is the dominant ideology, right? And if we as citizens, individually and collectively, don't exercise our legitimate rights, others will do so. Other very powerful interests with $1 billion market sector in public education will basically come in and occupy that space. So what my hope is that our call to action is to be more conscious, fundamentally, and to take these 4 big ideas, and you go out there with the We the Educators resources and really start saying, yeah, you know what, it's privatization and this push for standardization and this false sense of choice. And what does personalization mean? Yeah, it can happen in the public schools. You have to make sure class sizes and, you know, well-prepared teachers are in place, and all of these things that are being really conflated and used by the privatization pundits, we need to be really, really forceful with in terms of our perspectives and to try and make a more conscious civilization. So all of those resources you can find at philmcrae.com, also at the ATA website, or you can just go to wetheeducators.com. There are literature reviews on the research, 4 videos in English, Spanish, and French, and they're being used all over the world. So I really hope they're useful for you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Phil. You've given us so much to think about, and I think we'll be doing that for a while throughout the day and the week and maybe the month. So we do have some time for questions. We've got about 10 minutes or so for discussion, so please keep your comments and questions relatively short, and I'll try to recognize diversity in the crowd, and this is for both Barb and Phil. So let's start with the woman in the blue in the front here, please.
Thank you so much, both of you. I am wondering about the separate system that I grew up in. I was a former Roman Catholic, and so I've been, focusing a lot on not having a separate system. So is it just become more of a thing for inclusivity, just across the board? Is it just are we joining teams together and is that what's happening? I'm not sure of what the climate is, but...
Well, Support Our Students Alberta's position is for one public system. So all public dollars go to one public system that is secular, and that's what we advocate for.
Okay, so not a separate system of the...
Correct, just one system that's secular.
So the Alberta Teachers Association looks at the system that Catholic schools are in the public system, right? And so the idea is being, obviously this is being talked about and debated, but in terms of the constitutionality and the system structure, that's where our policy sits in the Alberta Teachers Association, is there is a public system, and it includes the public and the Catholic schools. We also see a lot of school jurisdictions now starting to find efficiencies where they have one combined busing or one combined infrastructure that's being used, and I think that demand is going to probably increase in terms of expectations, unless we go the other way, which is a massively fragmented system that is multiple private schools.
All right, let's go way to the back.
Hello. Thank you both for these presentations. It was an eye-opener. The comments that I will have will be one for each of you. I want to ask Barbara, was it that more like a generalization? Or, the school where my kids are more like, the exception? My kids are in the French Immersion. I just learned today that it's considered a private school. I wasn't aware. But what I can tell you is that there was no entrance, exam or any other type of assessment for them to get in. And also, just to mention that in the classes where both my daughters are, there is not just white kids. There are all other colors and different type of income and family status. We have, doctor, lawyers, immigrants, single parents with income that they just get by, or maybe even accessing campus food bank, or, food banks in the city. And the other one that I want to address to Dr. Phil was about the standardization. When I use standardization, I had totally different idea in my head. The standardization for me is, for schools, using the same type of curriculum. So meaning, if I have to transfer my kid in a different school, they have, the basic knowledge, the same concepts. So they're not, using a different language. That's standardization for me. I'm not sure if I'm using the wrong terminology, or, in nowadays you have different meanings, like, when you open the dictionary and see there 1, 2, 3, meanings. And also, the one that you showed us, I want to get some clarification, because the written script that you show us on the board, I was back, in my country, a teacher for a few years, and I learned about the lesson plans that you have to have before you go to the class. That looked for me like a lesson plan, which was, written step by step.
So we're going to have to get to the answers to the questions here because we've got
Sure.
a lot of hands up and not a lot of time. Can we go to Barb first?
Sure. So this concern around French immersion, we hear it a lot, and I think it's a really good example of being able to step away and stop personalizing the experience. It's like when we talk about systemic racism and we say, well, it doesn't. That's a generalization. I have brown friends and I have friends from. The reality of the situation in French immersion or any other selective schools is that marginalized children are counseled out of them. They might not have an entrance exam, but we know for a fact, because people come to us because it was documented and we've shown proof of that kids with learning disabilities will be told this program is not right for you. Because our resources are not here for English as a second language, you need to go to a different school. We know for a fact that when you start out in kindergarten, the population of French immersion schools gets smaller and smaller. Why? Because kids with disabilities, with dyscalculia, with dyslexia, kids who are living in poverty are counseled out of the program. And so that is a very benign way of cream skimming students. And it happens. And we as progressives have to stop being overly sensitive about the choices we're making and stop trying to defend them and recognize that maybe the reason we don't see them is because we are part of the privileged, because we are in it. But that doesn't negate that children across this province, for whatever reason, for multiple reasons of marginalization, are excluded from these programs on a day-to-day basis.
And I'll just address the standards. My colleagues and I, the teachers and principals in the Alberta Teachers Association, really want to raise this conversation about standards, not standardization, right? The idea that you can have standards, and I think what I heard you say is you're talking about standards, high quality standards, without everybody doing it exactly the same way. And the reason we're raising it is because, as you saw in this presentation, standardization is the mechanism by which you move towards privatization, right? That you create these common structures that are efficient and so on. So standards and standardization are not the same thing. And we want to create some cognitive dissonance around that conversation. In different parts of the world, this is a huge question. Some teachers associations don't have standards. We do have a teaching quality and a school leader standard in Alberta. But again, how you reach that peak, you need to have some flexibility, some local, that professional judgment, that professional autonomy is really important.
Gentleman in the blue seems to be getting antsy here. We know each other.
Thank you. I want to thank both of you for drawing attention to the degree to which, I think we have to sadly acknowledge this, the degree to which our current government has bought into these things. Because if we don't, we're going to run into trouble leading up to this election. In terms of the datafication and the standards, they focused, you notice what they focused on? Curriculum and testing, and they've ignored all these other areas. And secondly, in terms of buying into the language of choice, 14 organizations brought a proposal to cut funding to private schools, and the minister's response was exactly that of the odious Parents for Choice organization. One size doesn't fit all, and we believe in choice. And when this government repeats the language of the other side, we have a problem to address, I think, the way you are courageously doing that here. We have a problem to address over the next 6 months in trying to push all parties to this direction, all parties, not just fearing one that's going to come in.
All right, we'll take that as a comment. Let's go with Bridget.
Hello. So I wanted to address this idea of residency because I think you touched on it briefly, Barb, and it's not always discussed, is that ability for some families to move into a different neighborhood to access a better school. And we see that happening a lot in the United States where there are very tight school attendance boundaries. It's happening in some places in Alberta too, where we have large populations. And the other part of the residency question, and I'd be happy if you would both address this, is the question of course, one's residency is also affected by whether or not one is Catholic. Because if you live in a new neighborhood in a large urban area where there is a Catholic school in your community and you're a Catholic family, you can attend that school. Now, a public child can attend that school too until that school gets full enough or until they're diagnosed with a disability or things like that, and then they're kicked out of that school to attend to a public school, because only technically Catholic students are considered resident to that school and to that school district. And so other students are considered non-resident students and can be removed from the school at any time unless they can prove their religious identification. I think that's a part of this idea that Catholic schools are public schools that we need to address. And also just generally the idea of for families being able to move to new neighborhoods, to access better schools, which happens more often in school districts with very, very tight school school attendance boundaries, and how that affects this idea of choice and access and equity. Thanks.
These are really easy questions. You know, I'm going to step back for a second and just talk about something I've just experienced, right? Which is I took a delegation on an international research partnership to Reykjavik. And there were 3 small rural schools in Alberta that went. And one of the things that we learned there is that within 20 minutes, anywhere on the island of Iceland, you should be able to get to a public school, right? I think we need to, you know, one of their strategies is actually not to have schools of 800 or 3,000. One of their strategies is to have lots of smaller schools. Right? And I think we are built in, you know, part of the standards about standardization and all these things is we need some cognitive dissonance to the current system we have, right? Why is it that we have this? What is the, you know, we should maybe look at, I mean, if you look at the way that neighborhoods are built in terms of walking neighborhoods, and, you know, that I live in an area in Edmonton, and our children go to Edmonton public schools where they walk every day, both to the junior high and the elementary school. And that is not the norm. Right? But my dad, who's 89 years old, used to ride his horse to, you know, the school outside of Twin Butte. And I mean, all of our system that used to be located where you could get to a public school in residency, what we've started to do is build massive, massive schools, right, of 3,000 or 4,000 or whatever they are, and you create these hubs, right? I'm wondering if we need to challenge I know that it's more expensive. And I do understand that that's one of the considerations, but maybe we need to think about what is the optimum size of a school and a school community in terms of residency. I mean, that's just one kind of response.
And I'd just like to say that I think these discussions that we're having are what are preventing us from moving forward. So the public schools are busy challenging the Catholic schools are busy challenging the charter schools are looking at the private schools, and nobody's looking within. Public schools need to look at the barriers that exist for public kids. The Catholic schools need to look at the barriers that exist within Catholic schools. And the overarching vision cannot be pointing fingers at everyone else and looking at what public education should look. Is there a barrier? How do we remove it? What is making it difficult for kids to attend their school that's walking distance, that they can go home for lunch, that they can meet community members, they can walk with kids in their schools? What's preventing that vision? So start with the vision. And then how do we get there? But we have to stop pointing at everyone else. We are all part of this problem. We are all participating in this problem. We are all making choices because we are in positions of privilege that marginalize other people, and get away from that, because at every level, every person in education is participating in the system, and it is at this point inequitable.
Thank you, and sorry, that's all that we have time for. I know there were lots of other hands. I want to thank again Barb and Phil.